Ah, the 1980s. I was born in the 1980s. Good time. Not 1980 though. Years after that. Permanent Waves by Rush. We introduced in the tail end of the Hemispheres video that this was a time of change. This album was a big change for the band. And to really jump right in, we can just look at the very first two tracks that are on here, The Spirit of Radio and Free Will. Both of them are huge singles. They're both still played here in America on classic rock stations and even on some modern rock stations whenever they try to fuse in some tracks from the past. They are still considered to be huge parts of Rush's career. And really they were the biggest thing that the band had done technically on the radio up until 1981. So it was a little bit of a different construction. These were two songs that definitely had radio airplay and a little bit more of a simpler structure written all over them. In fact, this was an album that many people will say is when the band started to stray away from that complex storyteller mode, those long songs that could at times be a little bit overindulgent. And by and large, they would be absolutely right. There's no real complaint there. But there are two tracks on here that would beg to sort of differ a little bit, and that would be Natural Science, which is track 6 on this 6-track affair. They're still only doing 6 tracks. And also Jacob's Ladder. These two songs really illuminates that they were, while they wanted to do something a little bit different with this disc, and while they were transitioning into the 80s and wanted to sample some of the new technology of the arena, it was also one where the band did not want to stray too terribly far away. Jacob's Ladder is probably one of the more underrated songs that Rush has ever done. One that has a intense foreboding atmosphere to it. And it seems like there's always one song on every disc that feels like it's tremendously overrated, like it's one of their most overrated tracks, and it's because so many people, whenever it comes to Rush, so many fans even really stick with just the songs that are huge, the ones that they know, the ones that they put on their iPods and on their Walkmans, and those are the tracks that they listen to over and over and over again. Either that or what they've seen or heard on Guitar Hero or word of mouth. But Jacob's Ladder is a great track that just about any person that claims to be a fan of this band should check out. It's one that you're traditionally not going to see unless you happen to have a live version of it, or if you happen to own this album, if you happen to have Permanent Waves. But Jacob's Ladder is probably stronger than the two singles, based around the simple idea that it still kept and retained a little bit of that 70s prog charm, while also really enhancing that foreboding and dark atmosphere, which for Rush was something that seemed to only take place whenever they were going the high fantasy route. So this was a nice idea. And this was based off of a simple concept of the sun coming through the clouds. So it shows you that inspiration at times comes from just about anything. In fact, Natural Science, to conclude this album, is based off of science. You know, it's based off of just that simple of a concept. In fact, it was constructed after 3 days worth of writer's block that Neil Peart had. But this was a disc that for many was seen as transitional, but it was also, at the time, one of the band's most successful, if not the most successful. They broke through in America. And while this was the album that probably introduced Rush to a lot of homes, it would be moving pictures that would follow it up that would truly make them a phenomenon. Free Will and The Spirit of Radio were two really high-powered anthems that seemed to really describe the age. The Spirit of Radio especially. This is something that within the next couple of years we would be transitioning from The Spirit of Radio to Video Killed the Radio Star. This is unbeknownst to Rush, unbeknownst to all of us with MTV and everything of that variety, with the music video. But The Spirit of Radio was one that seemed to channel that now decades-long link that we've had to a radio dial. And it's one where this sort of concept of the transition of lifestyle in not only America but the world seemed to be a recurring theme that would occur in a lot of 80s Rush albums. This sort of, and it's one that certainly was painted by the actual transition that was going on in the 1980s, considering the 1980s were a very transitional decade for many individuals and for the world that we lived in. In fact, I've joked that starting in the 1980s we have slowly but surely fucked everything up. So the past 30 years we've slowly screwed everything up. But we didn't screw up music in the 80s, that's for damn sure, because this is another album that I think is sometimes overlooked. It's purchased a lot, I think, because of the two singles, because of the Spirit of Radio and Free Will. But I think it's a bit underrated. I think this is a disc that's a little bit underrated. Entre Nous is not necessarily the single that everybody wants it to be. I'm more of a fan, actually, of different strings. The piano in this track is absolutely gorgeous. It really is. And then whenever you get into Natural Science, it has some great potential, but at times you can see that it was the result of writer's block. You know, it was what came from it. And now there's a story that there was another piece that was meant to be on this disc. It was supposed to be more of a lavish piece that was very much like what Rush had done in the 1970s, but it was deemed to be a bit improper by comparison to this other work that was on the album. It would just have come out from left field and you'd have been like, the fuck was this? Some of the riffs and some of the portions of the music actually became Natural Science, so we kind of got a little bit of an idea of perhaps where the band was going with that. But this was based off of an Arthurian story, I believe, or at least one that has more of a Middle Ages, you know, high fantasy feel to it. Very similar to what you'd hear on an album such as A Farewell to Kings. But be that as it may, Natural Science also, it really seems like it has one of the most aggressive riffs that Lifeson has really pulled off right in the transition period between Hyperspace, which is part 2, into Permanent Waves. Permanent Waves, actually, for being the 5-minute meat of this track, actually feels like one of the weaker portions of this. Even though it drives home the choruses, you know, it really gives you that big song feel. It's one that definitely works very, very nicely along with tracks such as The Spirit of Radio and Free Will, and definitely gives the album a bit of a satisfying end from a theme standpoint, considering it stays within that musical theme, that musical idea. It's one that just feels a little bit weaker, like there's a lot more that could have been offered by this one, and this one could have really just, it could have broken down into something absolutely crazy, and instead it just feels like it went back to a bit of a safe area. But overall, Permanent Waves is a disc that I think is overlooked for some pretty bad reasons. It's one that is right before the big one. So whether or not you decide to circle your love for Rush around one big album, you may have this one, you may not. And you may think, well, this is not the Rush that I necessarily like if you're a bigger fan of the 1970s. Well, guess what? There is stuff on here that you're going to really like. Jacob's Ladder being one. You'll probably like some portions of Natural Science, and you will like the creativity of tracks such as Different Strings, and even Entre Nous. For those of you who are more modern fans, you might think, well, it's going to sound a little too old, it's going to be a little antiquated, and it's not going to be as strong as Moving Pictures. That's really not true as well. If you're a big Tom Sawyer freak, then you're going to love Spirit of Radio, Free Will, and you're going to find elements of the other tracks to be pleasing as well. This is not by any means a poor Rush album. In fact, they broke into the 1980s with their most commercially successful album until Moving Pictures. So, you know, we've been mentioning and citing Moving Pictures a whole heck of a lot during this review, where I'm basically just going to say, give Permanent Waves a chance. This is a better disc than you probably think that it is, unless, of course, it's your favorite Rush album. And if that's the case, then you know the majesty that this disc does hold. You know what this disc has to offer. But let's stop talking about this and get into the granddaddy, the one that everybody is waiting for. Let's talk next about Moving Pictures. Please, come back. It'll be happening very soon. I'm Coverkiller Nation, and I will ensure that. Like in 2 hours or so. Hit the subscribe button. I guarantee you within 2 to 3 hours, it might even be up by now. It might be. Yeah. Doing a whole discography. Have you been watching it? If this is your first experience, watch the others. I'm going to stop recording now. This is getting really awkward.